All right, thanking God again for different perspectives. But in addition to that, the way that he uses different perspectives to build our understanding or build on principles he's taught us in previous perspectives on a similar issue. And for that reason, let's call Luke chapter 14, livestock, we'll call it part 2. But over the course of dinner, as we mentioned this time with the Pharisees, he is going to build on that principle that helps them understand the dangers of prioritizing stuff over people. As I mentioned before in the last chapter, he is having to use that illustration with a group of those who are growing or mounting opposition to him, but it wasn't the Pharisees in the last chapter. If I did say that, I usually try to qualify by saying the Pharisees are a term that I use really unfairly to the Pharisees because they represent a larger group. And in the last chapter, it was not the Pharisees he had a problem with, but it was the ruler of the synagogue he rebuked with that call to reevaluate the value he places on his, or the value that they place on their livestock. However, this time it is at the invitation of one of the rulers of the Pharisees that he is going to have a dinner with them for the last time that I think we have it recorded in Luke's account of the life of Christ. And this time, as we said, he is not simply going to use the same example, even though he's going to use the same example. He's going to use it to build on the foundation of the conversation that he had with the ruler of the synagogue, that understanding the way that word seemed to travel in his day might have already gotten back to the Pharisees because they've already had their own version of Sabbath conversations or conflicts with the Christ. But with that, the first 6 verses of this chapter are going to show that conversation over dinner, where he once again is not going to back down from that conversation about the Sabbath, but quite directly in verse 3 starting, we'll say, and Jesus responded to the lawyers and the Pharisees, saying, is it lawful to heal on the Sabbath or not? But they remained silent. Then he took him up, and that was a man who had dropsy, described in the first couple of verses. He's going to take that man up and heal him and send him on his way. Verse 5 saying, and he said to them, which of you having a son or an ox that has fallen into a well on a Sabbath day will not immediately pull him out? Contrasting what we saw in the last chapter, where he uses the livestock as an illustration of their routine of just taking care of their livestock on the Sabbath. This time he's going to go back to that illustration we saw in Matthew, where he's going to say, in an emergency situation where you got an animal in distress, your heart goes out to that animal enough to take care of him on the Sabbath, not even thinking that you might be the least bit guilty of violating the Sabbath. If, as the ruler of the synagogue was ashamed when he was confronted with the fact that he cared more for his stuff than he did for people, if you care that much for your stuff, likewise, this time he's going to confront them with the need to have at least that much concern for people. But not leaving it at that point, he is going to build on that point in verses 7 through 11 by telling them not only do they have too little value for those who seem to be unimportant, they care way too much about their own rank among those who they do value. And in addition to that, he is going to give them another illustration from gatherings over food, where he's going to say in verses 12 through roughly 24, not only do they care too much about where they rank among those they care about, they care too much about what those who seem to be important can do for them in quite possibly either increasing their status or putting a little bit more money in their pocket, is the way I'm going to describe it. Either way, they care too much about what the haves can do for them to make them personally more successful. And those two illustrations, the one we mentioned from verses 7 through 11, and then verses 12 through roughly 24, are going to be respectively from 2 different parables that he is likewise, as we mentioned, going to tell about 2 gatherings, understanding that he is likewise teaching them about the attitude they should have towards dinner. He's going to give the parable of the wedding feast in verses 7 through 11, saying, don't compete for the best seat unless you put yourself in the position of having the host tell you that you've done too much. If you would have instead taken the lower seat, you get the honor of having them have you move up, as opposed to having them potentially having to move you down and embarrass you in front of everybody if you thought a little bit too much of where you ranked at the gathering. That's the parable of the wedding feast that led into the parable of the great banquet, where he is going to say, don't be preoccupied with winning the favor of those with clout, because God functions at a level that's way above the clout or anything that clout can bring you. And even though our only guarantee is for the blessings that God promises us after a life devoted to, as he does, looking out for other people. As we saw in the life of David, even though God doesn't promise us riches, he does promise us a level of peace and security that we might not otherwise have trying to be people pleasers. Understanding that the favor of people is what we call, sometimes I've heard described as fickle, meaning people can love you one minute and not even want to know your name the next. And so if that's what you're basing your stability on, much like his famous parable about building on the rock as opposed to building on the sand, people pleasing can become an exhausting way of trying to build a life and a future. And at its worst, it's both an exhausting way of trying to build a future and a flat out unstable way. Like he said, it's akin to building on sand. As the last part of the chapter is going to challenge them to shift their focus from trying to get the most that they can out of people to finding out what it's actually going to cost them to have God actually build them a more stable future. As verses 25 through 33 are going to make the famous challenge for them to count the cost in the somewhat or even completely shocking statement that anyone who would be his disciple has to hate mother, father, etc. And to be fair, even their own life in order to pick up their cross and follow him, which sounds fine if you're not trying to be a disciple. You just kind of want to be a Christian, right? Until you realize that back in chapter 12, he's already said something similar to all those who would basically be his or become his, at least so it seems. Double check me on that. Like I said, try to, as usual, post the quote up here in the corner. But even beyond that, it's going to be super similar to something we've already seen Matthew say in the Great Commission, where he's telling his apostles to go make disciples of all nations. And so it seems that it's not just the requirement he's making for an elite group of followers, but it sounds like the kind of challenge he's making to us all. And understanding that many will teach, and I don't know the language as well as many Greek scholars, but they'll tell you that, of course, this is originally in Aramaic, but either way, spoken in Aramaic, written in Greek, they'll tell you that he's not telling you to hate in the way that would make it a full contradiction to what God is telling us to do in the call to love all people. But they'll say he's telling you to deprioritize all those relationships in trying to fully become transformed into what God is calling us to be. And as much as I'm using that word transformed over and over, this chapter seems to give me a nuance on that understanding of what it means to be transformed, as the chapter concludes this way in verses 34 and 35, saying, "Salt is good, but if salt has lost its taste, how shall its saltiness be restored? It is of no use either for the soil or for the manure pile. It is thrown away. He who has ears to hear, let him hear." As he concludes this chapter in much the same way he began the Sermon on the Mount, challenging us to realize that much like salt without its flavor is useless, there are certain habits that we can pick up that make us likewise bland and potentially, as the Bible is literally going to call it, they don't use the term useless, but over and over, the Old Covenant describes the way in which, unfortunately, we can become what it calls worthless. And in the context of this chapter, it seems that Luke chapter 14 is warning about the ways in which people pleasing might be one of those things that can destroy the unique nature of the character that God has given us, to the point at which we become bland, simply trying to conform to an image of what other people would like for us to be. And on the other end of that spectrum, we can become so self-interested that we are not only cold-hearted to the needs of others, but we can become so narrow that we end up becoming just as shallow as people-pleasing can condition us to be. But understanding that, at least in my limited understanding, I believe that we all struggle with some degree of being too self-interested and then being too inclined to be people pleasers. The best way to go about escaping the trap on either ends of those spectrums is, if you're a believer, to allow God to transform your character into something that he understands will retain its flavor. Which reminds me why one of the names of Christ in the prophets is the Wonderful Counselor. And even more reminds me why God places such a value on us doing all of the things that he has counseled us to do, understanding that practicing a watered down version of his counsel ultimately produces a watered down or bland version of us.